God's been God a long time, but on the way to the top, God's rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. God's made many enemies, and somebody got pissed. Somebody's not happy. And now, what do you know? God is dead. I'm Larry Charles, and I want to know, who killed God?
Once the liars, the guilty, the people behind the killing of God realized that taking the oath on the Bible was bullshit, and the Bible was just a book, and there was no God, and there would be no retribution, the floodgates opened, and a different kind of flood flooded our civilization. The flood of untruths, the flood of lies, the flood that civilization will drown in this time. These are individuals who laugh at the oath, laugh at the Bible, who laugh at charges of perjury. No one in a position of power or prominence that you can think of or that I can think of in recent times has, despite the amount of liars and perjurers and evidence, proof that backs up so many of these charges, evidence that would send a working person or a poor person to jail for a lifetime, not one of these prominent perjurers, liars, mass rapists, and mass murderers has actually been prosecuted for perjury, for lying. They're not afraid because they know there is no God. And why do they know? Because they, in all their manifestations and permutations, there is a they killed God. It's time to take a closer look at some of these people, not just as criminals or as perjurers or even as murderers, but as the killers of God, the ultimate cosmic crime, the crime that has lined their pockets perhaps for centuries, for millennia, but also has hurtled our world and the universe into complete chaos. Now, there are those that will say this is crazy, but is it? When you think of how many people believe in God, isn't this real for them? And further, if you know the history, the sordid, dark history of some of the individuals and organizations that I'm about to attempt to raise a question about, if not outright accuse as potential suspects in this murder, is it really crazy, or does it make more sense than anything ever has? And when we look at the unrelenting horror, the hunger, the suffering, the displaced, the dead children, the wounding and maiming and the death, you know that there are those that wouldn't even let God get in the way of their agenda. These are people, forces, who wouldn't hesitate to murder God to accomplish their goals. And it's not going to be a single entity. If they get caught, they will try to blame it on a patsy, but it might be some multi-layered, intertwined conspiracy between various groups and people and forces. I can't even eliminate suspects who might be dead or in prison or even may not have existed. Hear me out. If we're talking about the killing of God, we are potentially talking about a multi-dimensional, non-linear, post-physics cosmic crime that may defy the rules of law, but also the rules of nature. I must keep an open mind. It's overwhelming. As we've learned, overwhelming and overloading us with bullshit is part of the plan. Where to start? Again, part of the consequence of being overwhelmed is paralysis. They count on that. If we are paralyzed, we can't do anything, maybe permanently. But even if our paralysis is temporary, it's enough for them to cover their tracks and cover up the crime. And again, remember the motivation. The forces that killed God, if he, him, her, they, it is dead or even existed, are always one step ahead. But that doesn't mean we don't do what we do. It doesn't mean we don't do what we can in the face of that. Yes, the powers that be always assume there will be a certain resistance. It's built into the system. But there are evolutionary, revolutionary moments when things go from stasis, from meaningless resistance to sudden change. Those moments in history when things pop through the veneer of lies and propaganda and misinformation and create transformation. And we never know where that moment is or when it will happen. That's how it happens. A mass subconscious will that asserts itself without our full awareness. So if we step back from the maelstrom they create, the dust storm intended to blind us to the truth, and the mirages that pretend to be real, we begin to see more clearly. Not very far, but at least in front of us. There it is, a path. And when you look around, you know it's the only path to follow. So let's take the first step. Who killed God? If you asked thousands of people in dozens of countries who killed God, what do you think they'd say? Well, of course, there is no poll like that, even though there should be. It would be very illuminating. But in my imaginary poll, why not? The answer is overwhelmingly, ironically, religion. Religion is the first on my list of suspects. They are a they, and they know. Whether it was the Catholic Church or Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Mormons or evangelicals, even Buddhists or Hindus and Scientologists, religion in whatever form it will take, and I understand we must narrow it down, but this is the first place to look, right under our noses. What better place to plot the murder of God than the house of worship, the house of prayer to God? Is that wrong? Or is that so obviously right that mankind's head will explode if the truth is exposed? But if you just think about it for a minute, it makes sense. First, you have organized religion. Organized religion has moved from representing good to a competitive, amoral, godless, multinational industry. In fact, each religion is its own corporation, but they all have the same agenda: keep you under control for their profit. So a God that loves the weak, not the strong, who loves the poor, not the rich, you can see how that God is in the way of religion itself. They used God's name, even as they murdered him, he, her, she, them, they, us. Let's briefly break it down religion by religion. Imagine if representatives of all religions were in a police lineup. Let's start with Christianity. Why don't we start with priests raping children and covering it up for thousands of years until this very day? They own more real estate than anybody, more precious art, more jewels and other valuables and sacred texts, and they don't pay any taxes. We have no idea what the church's money is invested in. Is there anything more evil than Christianity? And what even is Christianity? It's a good name, granted, great branding, but it's like 27 different religions. They're like a business that keeps going out of business, but then just changes its name. Or a suspect that has many aliases. Catholics, Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, Pentecostal, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Baptist, Methodists, Unitarians, Episcopalians, and on and on. It sounds more like an organization run by Satan, doesn't it? And there's new ones cropping up every day. Why? Why, if it's the Word of God, is there such vehement and at times violent disagreement about what that is? The church is a criminal empire given eternal immunity because they supposedly represent God. So what if they removed God from the equation, ran their conscienceless, godless, ruthless criminal empire with impunity, literally above the law because they created it, but justified it all publicly by proclaiming their actions and behavior the will of God? And isn't that what they do? I'd like to bring the Pope in for questioning. He knows, but he's more lawyered up than a mob boss. Think of the churches. God is in the way of the new version of religion. God would be fighting the absurdities and hypocrisies of modern religion. So they killed God and are in the midst of an active historical cover-up. God is a detriment to the marketing. God is a detriment to God. But all institutional religions are under suspicion. Think of the Mormons' origin stories and how they conflict with the Old Testament and New Testament. Think of Judaism, which is both being squeezed out by Christianity and other newer religions, and itself has internal conflicts about God that can't be resolved. We know that Islam and Christianity arise in the same place, really both offshoots of Judaism and whatever predates that. But they diverge quickly, like different branches of evolution, to create a global conflict. In fact, a bloody, violent, continuing global war about who's God. Even though purportedly Allah and Elohim are really the same. Can't you see the real God getting caught in this crossfire? Killing God would free these religions to pursue their true agenda: global domination and control. So you have the three Abrahamic religions, which all begin in the Middle East. While these people were the first to devote themselves to the one true monotheistic God, call it Allah, Elohim, Yahweh, or Jehovah, by the same token, there must have been people, Sumerians, Babylonians, Romans, or Greeks, who must have felt their gods pushed out by this new God. Now, since this time really predates history, it's virtually impossible to know, unless there's a tablet buried somewhere with a confession on it, if the killing of God took place during this time. We'd never know if it was an individual, a group within the larger religion, a breakaway group, or the religion itself that might have been capable of committing this crime. And as religions came along, Mormonism, Scientology, with their new concepts of God, they would certainly be motivated to kill their old God and establish their own gods in its place. The concept of God, and thus God, Him herself, has gotten in the way of the agenda of most of these religions. People will ask, what about Satan? Well, what about Satan? There's the argument that without God, Satan is nothing. Satan needs God to exist. But does Satan know that? Does Satan care? Wouldn't a character like Satan be willing to roll the dice in the fate of the cosmos without God? Doesn't Satan want to know what a world without God looks like? Isn't that Satan's goal? Destroy God and take over? After all, destroying God is why Satan exists. Or is it? I mean, Satan hasn't made any announcements like, hey, God is dead, I'm in charge. But of course, Satan, like God, works in mysterious ways. And if you look at the world verging on complete godless chaos, maybe Satan's already in charge. And then you have the existential question too. Does Satan even exist? There's no forensic proof of Satan's existence, but there's no forensic proof of God's existence either. Would it make things easier or more difficult to have definitive proof that God doesn't and has never existed? By the way, Satanism isn't the only openly anti-God religious movement. You also have a group called the atheists. They don't believe in the existence of God. Who better to murder God to prove a point? Is atheism a self-fulfilling prophecy? We killed God, and now we can say with authority that there is no God. Maybe the atheists know something we don't. What about science and medicine? Many consider those two disciplines to be God's greatest enemy. For science and medicine, God is an obstacle. In many ways, science and medicine have become essentially godless religions. Their answers and treatments and healings are based on a non-God standard. They want to end praying and devotion and superstition. But what are they replacing them with? A new form of prayer and devotion and superstition? A new dependence, free of the shackles and absurdities of a Bronze Age God. Imagine how much easier medicine and science treatment, research, and experimentation would go without an old-fashioned God trying to discourage people from trusting these modern methods. Think of science and medicine. God and the belief in God is so inconvenient to their mission. How hard would it be with the technology at their disposal to dispose of God without anyone even knowing it? Was God vaccinated and boosted? God would seem to be in the high-risk category. What about the superpowers, independently or collectively? Don't all superpowers stand to gain, even exploit a godless world? In that respect, is China any different than Russia, any different from us? Ironically, they are both our enemies and our partners. So you need to add America to any list of suspects. In some ways, America is the most suspicious superpower. Why? Because America pretends to be a God-fearing country, but its collective behavior as a nation is to sow chaos and destruction and death for profit under the hypocritical guise of doing God's work. Well, that's no different than any radical Islamic country, is it? Beware of anyone who proclaims they are doing God's work. Think about superpowers today, like Israel or India, where eternal battles are still being fought over whose God is God. That's a lot of motive, means, and opportunity to remove an opposing God and replace that God with your God who will do your bidding while seeming to be in charge. A figurehead God. And there we are, back to false idols. Aren't we all worshiping false idols now? What if God, he, she, they, them, him, her, itself, was a false idol. And while we're talking about suspicious superpowers, don't we have to go back to the superpowers of antiquity? Rome, Egypt, Greece, Sumeria, Babylon. They were battling over gods, stealing each other's gods, remaking each other's gods, even killing each other's gods, and then killing their own gods only to replace them with new ones that could be manipulated more easily. And what about the empires that controlled the world in the time before time? We don't even really know who they are, lost in the sands of time. Who were they? What did they believe? What did they believe in? Did those gods die when those civilizations died? Was God killed by those civilizations before recorded time? Or did God destroy those civilizations? And if we were to go back that far in time and imagination, what about Jesus? Murdered by his own father. And the Virgin Mary? She was raped by God. Was God's murder an act of revenge, as inevitable as everything that led up to it? Where the tragic fate is planted at the very beginning of the story? Let's face it, there are many biblical suspects. The list is as long as time itself and as unlimited as our imaginations. We think we know all these stories, but when you actually look at them, they don't read like the Bible. They read like a series of police reports of numerous dangerous, violent incidents by the same pathological suspect, where the suspect was detained but never arrested, or arrested then set free, and then one day that suspect, who's been doing the same thing for years, finally kills somebody and it's too late. It sounds like God's been wreaking havoc since the beginning of time, and everyone has looked the other way. Think about Adam and Eve. God is a shitty landlord, and God uses bait and switch techniques to throw them out of the Garden of Eden. Did he want to raise the rent and bring in new tenants? They had everything, literally, and they lost it all. Here's the Garden of Eden, rent-free. But if you touch any of the beautiful fruit of the tree of life or knowledge, you are out on your ass. God evicts Adam and Eve for being human as he created them, and uses the serpent to trick them because they are the first humans and thus are essentially innocent, naive babies. They are punished for being his creation. I mean, was there anyone ever as pure and good as Adam and Eve? And they were punished. It was abusive. They had to escape. Was it the Garden of Eden or a cellar in Cleveland where that guy kept those women hostages? They had to get out. And we never find out, of course, what really happened to them or even what they were thinking or feeling about the whole traumatic incident. Today, they'd be doing the interview circuit and writing memoirs and having documentaries and miniseries made about them. Let me get this straight. You're made in the Garden of Eden, it's the only home you know, and the landlord kicks you out for eating an apple? I think we have a case. Also, we see this connection between God and Satan again through biblical time. The serpent and God and the serpent. It's a fucking buddy comedy. This is a twosome. This is not a monotheistic God. God is like a supervillain wreaking havoc, and the serpent is like the sidekick. What about Abraham? God pranked him into almost fucking killing his kid. God says, sacrifice your son. And Abraham, he doesn't have a lot to base this experience on, thinks he better do what he's told, is about to do it, when God laughs and says, come on, I'm just fucking with you. Is that supposed to be a joke? Maybe the Bible is a humor book. I mean, if they had cameras back then, the Bible could have made a pretty cool prank show. God as Johnny Knoxville. So God destroys all the wicked in the flood, but then, what do you know? A few stories later, somehow the wickedest places of all, Sodom and Gomorrah, emerge. Which brings us to Lot. First of all, Lot was no bargain. Under pressure from the Sodomites, he offers his 2 virgin daughters to them. Nice, Dad, thanks a lot. But the mob refuses. They're already fucking and sucking each other. What are they supposed to do with a couple of virgins? But God decides Lot and his family are the ones to escape the fun resort towns of Sodom and Gomorrah. And Lot's wife, like his daughters only identified as Lot's wife, no name, very respectful, glances back for a moment to see the place she called home, where she raised an albeit dysfunctional family, and boom, God turns her into a pillar of salt. Why? And why doesn't God undo it? Hey, I lost my temper a little bit, I'm sorry, boom, you're not a pillar of salt anymore. And so then it's just Lot and his daughters. And you know what happens to men and women in the Bible, despite and no matter what their relationship might be, they fuck. He fucks his daughters. God makes the excuse that Lot was drunk, but today that wouldn't cut it in court. But God never takes responsibility. God was the first one to do that, commit a crime, but insist on his own innocence. It's worth remembering how much of civilization was perpetuated by these type of liaisons. Fathers fucking daughters, rape, incest, lying, trickery. Humankind exists because of these completely unacceptable, inappropriate relationships. By the way, you ever notice we never asked the women in the Bible how they felt about all of this? God doesn't even bother giving these characters names. God was a misogynist. There were only 2 books in the Bible named for a woman. And you see this again and again. Unsavory, incestuous rapists being given second chances while innocent, unnamed people, entire societies and civilizations are wiped out. Take Aaron, Moses' brother. They were pretty tight. So you can imagine how it must have infuriated Aaron after Moses does everything God says and leads the chosen people to the promised land, and then fucking God kills him at the banks of the Jordan. How is that fair? Sorry, Moses, thanks for the help, but you can't come in. Die here in the sand. And Cain, you got Abel, a nice guy trying to please God, and he does. And you have Cain, a fuck-up. Cain sees God favoring Abel. It's not Abel's fault. He didn't do anything but be good. And you know how the good are regarded in the Bible. Death. God could have said, we need to talk this out. Let's fix this. But no, God keeps shoving Cain's nose in it until finally, driven to insanity, Cain kills Abel and tries to cover it up. Was this the best solution? What about therapy? You go, okay, therapy wasn't invented yet. Why not? Couldn't God have invented therapy in biblical times just as easily as he did in the 20th century? But again, in keeping with God's MO, he lets Cain off with a little cool mark on his head. People see it and they go, hey, that's cool. Where'd you get that? I'd like one. Like a cool tattoo. And Cain tells them he murdered his brother for God. So now everyone who gets the message, kill somebody, and not only will God spare you, but he'll give you a special sign on your forehead. So God sends Cain off to populate the world. Again, no humankind without an unrepentant, unpunished psychopath to produce progeny. What about Job? So obviously God and Satan are hanging out between chapters of the Old Testament. Who knows what the fuck they're doing? Are they getting fucked up on the tree of knowledge fruit? Or wine made from the blood of virgins? Or are they fucking each other? Or is God a schizophrenic and he's actually Satan too? That would be a good twist at the end of the Bible. God is Satan. But although it seems plausible, unfortunately it's only speculation. However, sometimes we get a glimpse, like in the story of Job. Job is described as a good man. So of course, God fucks with him and makes him suffer. And not for any good reason, but because God, besides being a sadist, is a degenerate gambler, and God and Satan make a bet to see if they can break Job. The next thing you know, Job is mercilessly tortured, and his whole fucking family is dead. It seems like the answers are as different as the people you might ask. There are those that seek to blame so-called terrorist groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or Boko Haram or Al-Shabaab. Are they perpetrators of this crime or just convenient patsies? Maybe God is being held right now in a black prison site or has been murdered without fanfare. Perhaps God was murdered without anyone realizing it was God until it was too late. Others will blame the Democrats, the Republicans, and God knows they're guilty of many things. As another apparatus of the ruling class, flunkies of the controlling class, they facilitate much of what we now classify as evidence of God's murder. The unchecked suffering, death, and destruction of the planet and all living things upon it. They are part of the profit machine, like NATO or the UN. They pretend to do good, but really they sit idly by and mostly silently by as the world is destroyed by the greedy. Because it's those same greedy forces that underwrite these organizations. That is what unites them, and that is what makes them suspects in the murder of God. There's been a lot of death, a lot of killing amongst all these suspects. But did they kill God? In a court of human law, they might say that past genocides and murderous rampages are inadmissible. And what underlines and supports the great religions and superpowers today? The hidden forces of multinational corporations. They control the politicians and the world leaders. The superpowers answer to them. They see themselves as the new gods. And who would be more in conflict with the new gods, the avant-gods, than the old god? These new gods are already responsible for much of the world's chaos and misery and suffering and violence and sickness and death. And exploiting the destruction of the world for profit is their only agenda. So what would they do about something who got in their way? Even God. They could, or maybe have, killed God, and we might not even notice. Do you know the name of the largest multinational corporation in the world? Apple. How can a company named Apple not be involved in the murder of God? We know that no one individual can harness the resources to pull off this crime. Not Trump, not Elon Musk, not Bill Gates, not Mark Zuckerberg, not Jeff Bezos. But the death of God would benefit them all. And the murder of God would be in the final step of gaining control over their own destinies and by extension, asserting their control over ours. So we see the connections between the world's institutional religions, the global superpowers, and the multinational corporations. We see the individuals, groups, forces that stand to gain are motivated to kill God. It is a conspiracy that extends backwards and forwards in time. But if we could stop for just a moment, we could see it clearly here in the present. How do we bring criminals to justice if the criminals are not considered criminals and there is no justice? How do we bring criminals to justice if the system doesn't even acknowledge that a crime has been committed? If the world were a paradise for every living thing, and there was no suffering or pain or grief, I would be okay with the death of God. But the world is no paradise. It is sinking into hell. Not literally, but you get the idea. In chapter 7 of Who Killed God? The Perfect Crime, we will ask a very different set of questions than we did at the start of this pilgrimage to a new truth. But the central question remains, who killed God? If you see anything, hear anything, know anything that might lead to the apprehension of the killer or killers of God, please leave your comments below and we, again I'm we, will follow up diligently and investigate thoroughly. There is no statute of limitations on this. The ultimate crime. We won't and shouldn't rest until we know who killed God. And please, feel free to leave any thoughts, ideas, opinions, and questions you might have in the comments section. And if you have nothing better to do, subscribe to my channel, Larry Charles Projects. Unlike almost everything else these days, it's free.